Hi, everybody. I'm Ryan Claycomb. I am a professor of English, interim director of the Humanities Center, and on the coordinating committee for the Campus Read. Usually, I would be Susan Jennings-Lance, but I'm not. Susan is leading students on a study abroad trip in Brazil right now, and you will see her in just a second. But I wanted to start by talking about our Campus Read from 2017-18 a little bit. As you almost all certainly know, we had a really successful year with Hidden Figures, the history about the women who did much of the important computational work for NASA, and we tracked a lot of our touches with students, right? So we don't know how many people actually read the book, but we know that our programming activities were, I'm going to go ahead and say, wildly successful. We had, if you look at the top there, we had over 12,000 individual touches across all of our programming. Some of those were direct touches. Over 405 people came to the planetarium shows. Our talks with Emily Calandrelli and Jerry Ross had total audiences of 1,200 or a little more. Class activities, we charted at least 1,200 students. And the large scale events, we tracked, and this is probably, some of this is indirect touches, we tracked over 6,000 individuals who walked through some of those exhibits, events, etc. And so you can see that there's a really wide reach to the Campus Read. And over the last several years, I think the committee who's been doing this is really proud that even when the book itself may not be read entirely, it's starting a campus conversation, right? And that common campus conversation is really one of the primary goals of the program, is to get people talking about a series of issues, a series of questions, a series of processes that are in more or less ways endemic to what it is that we do here at a university, really across the disciplines.
Hi there. My name is Susan Jennings-Lance, and I was the director of the Campus Read for the 2017-2018 academic year. And this year, we actually had the book Hidden Figures. I'm sure you've heard of it. I'm sure you've seen the movie. You've probably read the book. You're probably very much aware. The great thing about this book was that two of the women featured in it were actually from at some point lived in Morgantown, West Virginia. And so we had a spectacular year finding out more about the hidden figures and about the lives of the women who were part of the NASA projects that sent people into space, about Katherine Johnson and Dorothy Vaughan, who were mathematicians and computer scientists and physicists. We learned about how Appalachian women can certainly go to town when the heat is on, and we learned just how resourceful the women from this part of the country can be. We had a lot of events. We had students going to the planetarium. We had a day of service. We had speakers. We had two wonderful, wonderful people who did a lot of research in this area. Carol Wilkinson and Marjorie Fuller did a lot of research on the lives of the women who are in Hidden Figures. We had speakers like Emily Calandrelli, who's a West Virginia University alum, who was able to come in and talk to us. She's famous now because she has done many things. She's an author about STEM books for young people. She's also a correspondent for Bill Nye the Science Guy. So all things considered, it was a fabulous year. I'm happy to report that with all the events that we put together, okay, we were able to provide students with 12,500 contact hours, meaning that 12,500 people, or sometimes people repeated more than once, actually spent some time understanding Hidden Figures. 10,000 of those were with students, and the others were from the community. Okay, so Hidden Figures, a great success. Yay, 2017, 2018, it was awesome. But now we need to think about 2018, 2019. This year, if you haven't already heard, the Campus Read Committee has selected the book Station 11. Station 11 is a fascinating book, and it's very different from Hidden Figures. This book tells the story of a woman who watches the world turn into chaos when a flu pandemic kind of wipes out 90% of the population. And it follows her after the pandemic as she becomes part of a traveling Shakespearean company and orchestra. Career goals for all of us, really. And so she goes around with this group and they perform and they experience art in a way that many of us have probably never dreamed. Now, I want to be clear. This book is not The Walking Dead. This book is not World War Z. There are no zombies. This book is not really very violent. It is not actually as depressing as you might think. The beginning part's a little scary, but it isn't. The main themes of this book are really about hope, art, the place that art has in community. The themes of this book include, like, what do you do if the internet collapses? What are we going to do if our technology fails us? And the trauma of living through a horrible event, okay? So this is a great book. It's about experiencing the humanities in our world and its place in community. It's going to be a fabulous year. We already know that we have the author signed up to come in September to speak to us. Ryan will talk to you more about that. We have other events planned. We're very excited about it. Every single person who we've given this book to read has said, hey, I really like that book. And that includes students that we've shared it with. So I'm very excited to announce that Station 11 will be the 2018-2019 campus read, and I'm very excited about the events we have planned. I'm very excited about the ideas you might have for future events, and I'm just very excited. Can't wait to hear what you have to say about the book. Thank you very much.
So if you know Susan, you know that she is actually just very excited. All right, so our campus read is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. Now, you already heard Susan mention that we've done a post-apocalyptic story in the past. You don't even have to go back as far as 2012 for that. But we know the tropes, right? The decaying infrastructure, the mass chaos. Oh, look, there's World War Z. Buildings burning in flames, blighted urban landscapes, alien explosions, declining standards of personal hygiene, man's general inhumanity to man, man's inhumanity to women, zombies' inhumanity to everybody, Tina Turner's inhumanity to man, this guy's inhumanity. But we don't often think of this when we get to post-apocalyptic stories, and we don't often think of this. So, as Susan mentioned, Station 11 is a book. It's a novel, first of all, right? So we've had 2 years of nonfiction. This is narrative fiction. It cuts across 2 different timelines, one which is basically in our present, and one which is about 20 years into the future. And it asks a number of questions that many of these post-apocalyptic narratives don't ask, right? It's not just how would we survive, but how would we retain our humanity, right? How do we maintain our humane selves? So I just want to read a little passage. Actually, it's a bit of a long passage, but it's quite beautiful, and I think it illustrates some of the ways that this book is thinking about these questions that's a little different from terror, horror, and trauma, but thinks of it through a lens of nostalgia. So this is chapter 6. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, although it's very short. An incomplete list. No more diving into pools of chlorinated water lit green from below. No more ball games played out under floodlights. No more porch lights with moths fluttering on summer nights. No more trains running under the surface of cities on the dazzling power of the electric third rail. No more cities. No more films except rarely, except with a generator drowning out half the dialogue, and only then for the first little while until the fuel for the generators ran out, because automobile gas goes stale after 2 or 3 years. Aviation gas lasts longer, but it was difficult to come by. No more screens shining in the half-light as people raised their phones above the crowd to take photographs of concert stages. No more concert stages lit by candy-colored halogens. No more electronica, punk, electric guitars. No more pharmaceuticals. No more certainty of surviving a scratch on one's hand, a cut on a finger while chopping vegetables for dinner, a dog bite. No more flight, no more towns glimpsed from the sky through airplane windows, points of glimmering light. No more looking down from 30,000 feet and imagining the lives lit up by those lights at that moment. No more airplanes, no more requests to put your tray table in its upright and locked position. But no, this wasn't true. There were still airplanes here and there. They stood dormant on runways and in hangars. They collected snow on their wings. In the cold months, they were ideal for food storage. In the summer ones, near orchards, they were filled with trays of fruits that have dehydrated in the heat. Teenagers snuck into them to have sex. Rust blossomed and streaked. No more countries, all borders unmanned. No more fire departments, no more police, no more road maintenance or garbage pickup. No more spacecraft rising up from Cape Canaveral, from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, from Vandenberg, Plesetsk, Tanegashima, burning paths through the atmosphere into space. No more internet, no more social media, no more scrolling through litanies of dreams and nervous hopes and photographs of lunches, cries for help and expressions of contentment, and relationship status updates with heart icons whole or broken, plans to meet up later, pleas, complaints, desires, pictures of babies dressed as bears or peppers for Halloween. No more reading and commenting on the lives of others, and in so doing, feeling slightly less alone in the room. No more avatars. Okay, so I did read all of chapter 6. What I'd like you to do actually is take a minute and talk to somebody near you about what if the power grid went down and our capacity to generate the technology that we rely on, what would you miss? Right, just talk for 2 minutes about what would you miss with somebody next to you. So a lot of the questions around novels that sort of imagine 99% of the population disappearing, they ask questions about survival, right? How would we survive? And my guess is some of those conversations that you just had were around survival, right? How would you get your food, right? How would you stay warm in the winter? Those kinds of questions. But I think by moving 20 years into the future, this book asks the question, what happens after that? The main character for this second half has a tattoo on her arm that comes, for the Trekkers in the room, from Star Trek Voyager, an episode, that survival is insufficient, right? That survival is great, we want to survive, but it's not enough. The book asks the questions, what makes life sufficient beyond that? And those are questions I actually think are really important for our undergraduate students, and really for all of us to consider, right? Is that we spend a lot of time focusing on how they're going to build a career. It's an important question, and how they're going to make their money. But the other half of the equation is, how are they going to live a good life? And by stripping some of that question down to its bare essentials, this asks those kinds of questions, right? If survival on its own is insufficient, what is sufficient? So, you know, just a few of the themes that we might imagine coming out of this book, and that this book kind of asks directly. What makes a culture? I won't spoil too much, but there's a character in the book who collects artifacts from the world before the Georgian flu, and it becomes a bit of a museum of the world before. And it's things like iPhones and gum wrappers, right? Things that are vestiges of the world that we once knew, but don't function in quite the same way. And it asks us, the book does ask us to think about those in new ways. Obviously, the emphasis on the traveling Shakespeare Company and Orchestra asks us, what are the uses of the arts, right? But other questions, what are the characteristics of human resilience? Those are important questions for our students to be asking themselves. You know, we know that students, as anxiety increases, their own resilience is in question. The pressure on them is quite high. And developing resilience and asking them to think metacognitively about their own experience of resilience is something that's easily generated by a conversation about that in this book, where it sort of appears in extremis. There are questions about the value of friendship, right? That's not an academic question that we get to ask very often, but it's an important one for our students. What does the threat of violence do to our humane selves? And we can think about that as a much nearer question to our daily lives these days. And then how do we remember and respect those we have lost? We often think of that as a very adult question, maybe something that students don't want to think about, but students are losing siblings and parents and grandparents at the rate that all of us are. And those losses are important for our students to be thinking about as well. Now, I recognize these are very humanistic questions, right? And as the director of the Humanities Center, I endorse that. But I also know that they are questions that can be asked in a range of different contexts, right? They don't just have to happen in humanities classes, in writing classes, and in arts classes. But I also want to point out that the book offers a counterpoint to this survival is insufficient. You all got a bookmark here that has another character pushing back, right? Who says, well, yes, survival is insufficient, but in the context of a pandemic, so was Shakespeare, right? And the question about, yeah, the arts are important, the idea of culture is important, the idea of a humane life is important, but we also do want to not forget about those other questions, the things that make our daily lives now very much our daily lives that, you know, I always find myself saying, wow, we really do live in the future. And this asks some of those questions in ways that do bring us back to some more of those technical questions, questions of science, questions of technology, questions about the way we live in relation to them. So there are, first of all, some very, very direct science-oriented questions. How does a pandemic spread? We're already talking about the libraries, about having an exhibit about the 1918 flu epidemic, and thinking about what a bigger one might look like. How might it spread? How might our reliance on air travel make the spread of disease that much more massive compared to 1918? How would we care, and would we care for one another in the context of contagion? You know, years of working with honors students, I know that this question of care is one that's central to many of our pre-healthcare majors. Our nursing students are asking this question right from the beginning. I think that's an important question that this book addresses in many ways very directly. What would healthcare look like without advanced technology, without pharmaceuticals? What would it look like to go back several hundred years, knowing some of the things that we know, but not all of them? And then here's a question that I think is really important. What technologies would we work to reinvent? Which ones would we pursue? Which would we reinvigorate? But also maybe which ones wouldn't we? That's a question that's more indirect, but I do think that the passage that I just read asks us to imagine, well, maybe not all of these things are unambivalent goods, right? Those are good questions to ask as well. This next one is one that I want, actually, so what knowledge and skill would it take to rebuild our infrastructure? And then how would we educate ourselves without experts? The next thing I want you to do and think about, and this is, I think, a very useful question for students, I would like you to imagine if everybody who knows the things that you are an expert at were gone, right? And people in this room are experts at a lot of things, and people on this campus are experts at a lot of things. And I think this is a question that we can import into virtually every classroom. What would we do if all the people who knew this stuff were gone? Where would we get that information? I think it's interesting because this book does not mention libraries very much. And I think it's a bit of a plot hole, but it's a useful thought experiment to do in our classrooms. How would we develop this knowledge? How would we reinvent it, reinvigorate it if we just had books, right? If all the people who knew it and knew how to teach it were not here, right? In some ways, this book is kind of a testament to how important education is itself, right? The passing on of knowledge from one to another. There's a great little moment in the book where people don't quite understand 20 years later how the internet worked, right? And so they don't understand that it's not all quite resident on that box, right? That it's distributed. And the way that that points to the way that we already make knowledge, and the way that knowledge is really among people a distributed entity, is another important technical question. So just take a minute and again, talk to people next to you. If people in the world didn't have the knowledge that you are an expert at, how would they go about getting it? What would we have to do to get there? Discuss. And one of the approaches that we've taken as a selection committee in the past has been to use different years' books to bring in different constituencies, different knowledge bases. Each book is not going to function in the same way as the previous year's book. I think there are some pros and cons to this book. One, on the pro side, it's beautifully written, right? And I don't think I did justice to it in reading it, but the prose is lovely. It's a highly readable book. I have some former students who I know have taught it in high school with some success. It's not above our students' level by any stretch of the imagination. It is a page turner. I will recommend that if you haven't read it yet, do not read it on an airplane. Just a thought, which is what I did on the way to a conference. I was a little anxious when I got off and then promptly got a cold. So it's beautifully written. I have a fairly high degree of confidence that students who start it will want to finish it. The downside is that it's not super excerptable, right? And I recognize that that has some limits for classroom use. There are sections that you can take out, but in some ways I think we're going to hope that more students read it cover to cover than have done in maybe the last two books, and we'll depend on that a little bit more. On the other hand, I think that's more of a likelihood because it is it's a propulsive book, it's a lovely book. And I think students are going to say, this was a good book, not just that's an interesting set of ideas or that's an important topic. And hopefully they say both. You know, just anecdotally, Goodreads has over 200,000 ratings of this book, and they're all, you know, the average is above 4.0 out of 5. So it's a widely highly regarded book. And yet, there are ways to critique it, and I encourage you to bring those in. So one of the first questions is, how are we going to use this in our classrooms? And I can't answer that for everybody, but one of the things that we say every year when we do this presentation is that you don't have to read it in class, right? Our hope is that the more that this becomes a campus conversation, the more that we can rely on students having had contact with it in one way or another. Certainly first-year students, but we're really hoping that the conversations will continue forward from there. That might mean that you only reference it, or you talk about it in a lecture as a, hey, here's a thought experiment. Let's think about this in this way that connects to the campus read. There are going to be ways that you can engage it more directly, and we're hoping that, as in years past, that will happen at the level of individual instructors, individual faculty members who bring ideas of their own into the classroom. I don't know how many of you were in the last session that Tom and Nancy and Sarah conducted on using it in the English 101, using hidden figures in the English 101 classroom. But there was a variety of ways, and the thing that I found most heartening about their process is that they, instead of delivering a batch of prefabricated lesson plans to their faculty, they asked those faculty to generate their own ideas in the context of their own classrooms, and those ideas were really robust. Really fantastic. So let me encourage you, as you are thinking about using this in your classroom or thinking about spreading the word, that you encourage people to find ways to incorporate it into their own. The campus read generally does, for its success, depend on that phenomenon, right? The degree to which people take it and use it in classrooms, either in direct conversation or indirect conversation, to help generate that common discussion, right? That central idea that is something that we can ruminate across for a whole year, maybe not just a couple of minutes. Other ways that you can get involved: announce and attend campus read events. As you saw from the beginning, we have a truckload of them, and we have a bunch of them that we're trying to prepare for next year as well. Those are very much still in the formation process, since we've only had this book selected for a few weeks now. But that process does involve and is involving reaching out to places like public health and biology, as well as places like English and the College of Creative Arts. So we're really hoping to get a wide variety of programs and a wide range of people coming to bring their own expertise to this. And some of those are going to be really directly get involved. Some of those are going to be panels. We will, as we mentioned before, and I'll pop the details up here in a second, we'll have the author here for a conversation in September. The other thing, though, is you can do more than just create programming or create lessons in your classroom. You can think about creating programming where you are, right? So just because the Campus Read Committee hasn't sort of hit your discipline, do reach out to us. Tell us, really, we would love to be able to hook in this way. Here's a thing that we think we can do. Here's a student-centric way that we think that we could take this outside of the classroom. We're really happy to collaborate on those things. And again, the more that this is a grassroots campus conversation, the better. To that end, we will be duplicating and hopefully slightly formalizing the program that we had last year for programming grants for the Campus Read. We're still hammering out the budget and the details on those, but we very much want to incentivize, especially when resources will be useful to get those kinds of programs up and running. We want to incentivize people taking this and running with it, right? As much as we as a coordinating committee, a selection committee, programming committee, sort of are doing some things centrally, we don't own this idea. And we very much want to sort of have other people buy in. So be on the lookout, especially if you're on the Friends of the Campus Read mailing list. Do be on the lookout for that. We'll also publicize that in other ways. And then if you're really interested, right, if this is a topic or a book that is really directly related to something that you do or something that you want to get involved in, we're changing our structure for our organization this year a little bit. We found that as the Campus Read has grown in impact, we've brought more people to the table, and we're really sort of trying to find a way to organize that process better. So this year, and I'll just sort of describe it briefly, we have a coordinating committee of a few people, but then we're breaking out the larger committee into two groups, one of which is based on programming for this year, and another of which is sort of dedicated to selecting future ones. So especially if you want to make, you know, you might want to make a commitment to this book, but don't necessarily know that next year's is going to be interesting to you. You can be on the programming committee for 1 year, and if you really have great ideas or really think that you have something that can buy in, please contact me or contact Susan Jennings-Lance. And I'll even leave a little notepad up here that if you'd like to sign up for one of those as well. The point here is that while we'll be generating a lot of things, we really do want you and your students to come at this book and come at these ideas in your own way. As promised, mark your calendars, September 19th, we've reserved the Clay Concert Hall in the Creative Arts Center for a visit from the author. We're still figuring out quite the structure of that, but she's asked to be in conversation. She's less likely to lecture at us and wants to really sort of have a discussion. And I think that could make for a really extraordinary evening that's not just a canned talk. So please be aware of that. The Clay holds a lot of people, so we hope that we'll be able to accommodate even more than we have in past. 7:30 p.m., great, because I initially wrote sometime. And if you forget between now and September 19th, I can guarantee there will be a publicity blitz. So getting involved in the future, I just mentioned that we have a new structure. We'll be putting out a call probably sometime in August for suggestions to the Campus Read. We'll narrow that down for a selection committee to really focus on 4 or 5 of those. Our process, and we always get questions about what our process is. Our process is going to get a little bit more structured this year, but we already have a way for, actually a couple of different ways for students to give us feedback. Our selection committee is really going to aim for an earlier selection so that we can get programming started even earlier next year, you know, pending or assuming that we don't have some major incident that requires us to scrap everything and come up with a new topic, as sometimes has happened. But if you're interested in the selection committee, this is also something that is a really important group of people because we need a range of ideas, right? Part of the thing about sort of moving across disciplines is that we need folks with different interests that represent the wide diversity of interests on our campus. So think of it as a really, really high impact book club. And that's what we're hoping it'll be for the coming year. And then also, if you're not already on it, sign up for our Friends of the Campus Read list, which is a couple of hundred people long already. It just means that you want to stay in contact with what we're doing and see how how things are proceeding over the course of the year and through the coming years. And like I said, I will use my very official form here, this notebook. So if you're interested, come and sign up. I'm running close to out of time, but do we have questions from the floor about the book, the process, anything Campus Read related? As far as I know, there's never been any particular limit. I think what we're looking at here is purpose, right? Purpose is about, it has to be a book that's going to generate a conversation. It has to be a book that our students are going to read. And that's a very real consideration. This year we've also got the Morgantown Public Libraries involved, so some broader community interest is something that's desirable. But really what I think of is if we can think of our first audience, but not only audience, as incoming students, right? So a little anecdote. This is the 200th year anniversary of Frankenstein, and I was pushing that idea pretty hard until somebody said, are we going to get incoming freshmen in mass to read Frankenstein over the summer voluntarily without the guidance of a class? And the answer was no. No, but we still should. But, you know, so I backed off of that one. So the idea, I think, is not, I mean, that's a 200-year-old book that I was advocating, but it needs to be something that students are going to engage in at their own pace with some kind of voluntary buy-in, which means that, you know, something 200 years old probably won't do that on the face of it, but whether a book is 1 or 10 or 20 years old doesn't necessarily restrict it. So, you know, keep your suggestions. We've had suggestions all across the board over the years, although I think our tendency does run toward the contemporary. Other questions? I must have been very thorough. Thank you for your time. We hope there's lots of buy-in over the next year. Thanks.